Thank you very much for your patience, and we are ready to begin with our second session for today. Our second session is entitled Reshaping International Order and Global Economic Landscape, Prospects for U.S.-China Relations and Geopolitical Implications. For this session, our distinguished moderator is Dr. Il Seogong. Dr. Seogong served as Minister of Finance and held other prominent positions that include Director of Finance at the Korea Development Institute, Special Economic Advisor to the President, Chairman of the Korea International Trade Association, and Chairman of the Presidential Committee for the G20 Summit. He is also founder and Chairman Emeritus of the Institute for Global Economics. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Seogong to moderate our second session. Thank you.
네, 여러분들 반갑습니다. 앞에 우리 정광우 이사장께서도 얘기했습니다마는 이 회의는 곧 여기서 토론된 것을 프로시딩스로 출판이 되고 또 많은 foreign 온라인 뷰어스들도 있기 때문에 영어로 회의를 진행하도록 하겠습니다. Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's so nice to see you all here attending this conference in person. At the same time, I would like to extend warm welcome to all those who also participate in this conference virtually in cyberspace. Well, this session is about the global economic landscape and the changing international order, particularly focusing on the intensifying the U.S.-China hegemonic competition and global geopolitics. The main purpose of this conference is to provide a macro framework and the overall background for discussing the main theme of this conference, the ESG and digitization. For that reason, originally this session was scheduled as a first session, but for convenience of some of the speakers, we rescheduled, and so we hold this session now. We only have 50 minutes, but still we started a little bit late, so we don't have much time. But I'll tell you how we will proceed this session. First, we'll have a very brief pre-recorded video remark by Dr. Richard Haas, who is president of the Council on Foreign Relations in New York. And then we'll also have pre-recorded my conversation with Professor Michael Spence, who is a Nobel laureate and well-known scholar. And then lastly, and not the least, of course, we have Professor Park Chul-hee of Seoul National University, who will share his views on the global geopolitics and particularly geopolitics in this region. So we will have very compact 40-50 minutes. Before we view Dr. Haas, the video taped remark, let me say just a few words about Mr. Haas. He is very well-known veteran diplomat and very prominent voice on foreign policy in the U.S. He has been heading the very, very prestigious and influential U.S. think tank, which is Council on Foreign Relations, for almost 19 years. So he is becoming an institution himself. He will make a very brief remark, mostly on the U.S.-China competition, the hegemonic competition. So with no further ado, let's listen to what he says.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. This is Richard Haas from New York, and it's a real pleasure and an honor to join you. I'm sorry it's virtual, but that is the world we seem to be living in these days. I do, though, want to congratulate the conference organizers. I looked at the agenda. It is comprehensive, it is ambitious, and it is relevant. So well done. And again, I'm sorry I'm unable to be with you, but hopefully the day will not be too far off when once again we can travel around the world, which is probably a good and necessary thing for those of us who are in the field of foreign policy and international relations. What I wanted to talk about was the relationship between the United States and China. And then I also wanted to talk a little bit about what I thought the implications and consequences might be, some of the considerations for the Republic of Korea. But let me start with the U.S.-Chinese relationship. It's something of a cliche, but often cliches are true, that this is and is likely to remain the most significant relationship of this era of history. What is obviously unknown is what trajectory it will take, but it will obviously have tremendous consequences for both of these countries, for the United States and China, for the region, for the Asia-Pacific, or if you prefer, Indo-Pacific region, indeed for the world. Because the ability and willingness of the United States and China to not simply avoid confrontation, but to find a way to cooperate on meeting regional and global challenges will have enormous implications. Indeed, it becomes a very different century, depending upon the character and the direction of U.S.-Chinese relations. That said, it would be hard to feel good about where they are if one were to measure where this relationship is today as opposed to a year ago or 2 years ago or 5 years ago. It's measurably worse, measurably more complicated. I'll simply talk about it from the American point of view. What's interesting is, as you know, in our country, there's often major divisions between our political parties, between Republicans and Democrats. But on this, there's considerable agreement. There is a widespread disillusionment with China, not with its having emerged with more power, but rather the nature of its behavior. There was a hope that Chinese integration, participation in international institutions, the IMF, the World Trade Organization in particular, would bring about a certain evolution in China, that we would see a more open China politically, a more market-oriented China economically, a more restrained China strategically. And in each one of these areas, there is disappointment. China is more closed and more repressive at home. What happened in Hong Kong made a mockery of the one country, two systems principle, but also was inconsistent with Chinese commitment to the UK and to the international community. Their treatment of the Uyghurs is a matter of widespread concern. So there's real disappointment with China's political direction. Economically, widespread dissatisfaction with a pattern of intellectual property theft, massive state subsidies and investments in critical industries. So the idea, again, that China was going to become more market-oriented hasn't happened. The state-owned enterprises have not faded away by any means. And then strategically, the concern is not simply with China's military buildup, but how it's using it in the South China Sea, the pressure on Taiwan, the pressure on Japan, and so forth. So we're seeing a benign word would be a more assertive China. Some might call it a more aggressive China, but clearly the era of Deng Xiaoping associated restraint is over. Xi Jinping's China is widely seen in this country as very different, and the differences are not, for the most part, welcomed by Americans. And I think what you're seeing, what you have seen, what you will see from Democratic and Republican administrations alike is a strong response, greater emphasis on competition, certain greater emphasis on technological distancing, both in what is allowed to reach China, about Chinese investment into the United States. It will not be full decoupling, but there will be a degree of separation or distancing. I already mentioned the greater emphasis on competitiveness, on steps that we would take, on supply chain resilience to become less dependent on critical imports from China. In the strategic area, also a real concern, say, in particular about Chinese pressure on Taiwan, with given what has happened in Hong Kong, real concern about what this portends for Taiwan. So this is the backdrop. This is a more competitive relationship. It's a more problematic one. I always say the goal is to work so that our differences do not lead to direct confrontation. That ought to be a goal, because if there is direct confrontation, that would be in the interest of neither country nor anyone else. At the same time, we would like to keep open areas of cooperation, including what you might describe as non-strategic trade and investment. We would also like to keep open the possibility of selective cooperation, obviously on a situation like North Korea, but also on global challenges such as climate change. But I've got to say, in those areas like climate change, the developments are not auspicious. China's emphasis on continued emphasis on dependence on coal is not welcome. It's pushing off its commitments on climate to at least 2060. The vagueness of some of those commitments are not welcome. On areas like world health, China's refusal to cooperate with the investigation into the origins of COVID-19 are not to say the least, reassuring. So that is where we are in this. So what does this mean, though, for South Korea? That the future, for the foreseeable future, will be one of considerable U.S.-Chinese competition and friction. With North Korea, I think there's real questions about Chinese willingness, to some extent ability, but certainly its willingness to rein in North Korea. There's recent reports of what North Korea is doing in the nuclear realm, which are worrisome to say the least. China is in a position to exert considerable influence over North Korea, given North Korea's trade going in and out through China, and China has elected not to do that. And that is a matter of real concern. Could they? Of course they could. They could play a much more constructive role. Hopefully they will. And that is, I would say, ought to be one of the goals of your relationship, South Korea's relationship, and our relationship with China. I think for South Korea, for the Republic of Korea, what I talked about in technology will pose some big issues. I understand China's importance to the Republic of Korea economically. I don't believe the United States is or will ask South Korea to fundamentally change that, but there will be pressures to limit certain types of technological transfer, to be very mindful of what you might call strategic dependence on China, a strategic dependence that could be manipulated. So if I had to sum it up, it would not be asking South Korea, the Republic of Korea, to choose between the United States and China, who obviously have important security relations with us and important economic relations with both countries, but to approach your relationship with China mindfully and with great care. I think that is something that would be essential. I think in terms of certain scenarios to be mindful of, there's clearly that of Taiwan. And I think one of the questions for policymakers, defense intellectuals in the Republic of Korea is to think about that. I believe Japan is moving in the direction of a greater strategic association with the United States, understanding that Chinese pressures against Taiwan would have tremendous adverse implications for Japan. And I would hope that the Republic of Korea would also think about what its posture would be, both to deter such a scenario, but also how it would respond to one, its willingness to participate in collective efforts there. You all know about the Quad, the new strategic grouping in your part of the world with India, Japan, and Australia and the United States. I'm not asking the Republic of Korea to join the Quad. If you did, we could no longer call it the Quad, and I don't think people want to call it the Pentagon. I think that would have other associations. But I do hope there could be some degree of interaction, that if you have the Quad, I don't see any reason why the Republic of Korea could not do certain things with it without formal membership. And as part of that, or either as part of that or separately, the splits, the frictions between the Republic of Korea and Japan, I would think, or I would argue, are in the interests of neither country and don't help any of us in terms of our larger investment in stake in the stability and security of the part of the world in which you find themselves. And obviously, given what I've said about China, it's important that the United States and its allies in the region, and prominent and preeminent among our allies are Japan and the Republic of Korea and several others such as Australia. But in the case of Japan and South Korea, that it would be strategically counterproductive or self-defeating or worse for your frictions to get in the way of your collective ability to work with one another and to work with us. So again, I come back to where I began. I think we're entering a very difficult period of relations between the United States and China. And this places a real premium on our ability to cooperate with our closest strategic partners, diplomatic partners, and economic partners in the Indo-Pacific, in the Asia-Pacific, and the Republic of Korea is one of those partners. So I applaud you for putting these issues on your agenda. I hope your conversations go far, are creative and imaginative. And I hope at the end you produce some policy-relevant, policy-specific recommendations, whether they're for my country, for any of your neighbors, or for the Republic of Korea. So thank you for giving me these few minutes to give you my thoughts on one of or some of the most important issues of our day. And again, I wish you all the best with your conference, and beyond your conference, I wish everyone health and safety in this difficult time that we are all living in and going through. Thank you very much.
Well, within very short span of time, he touched on many critical and interesting security-related, geopolitics-related, particularly relevant to this region. I appreciate that very much. I'm sure Professor Park will touch on some of these issues, I'm sure, which Dr. Haas just alluded to. So let's move on since we don't have much time. Now let's turn to my conversation with Professor Michael Spence, primarily focusing on the global economic landscape and some aspects of global governance, not corporate governance. By the way, the Professor Spence, who is currently with the Hoover Institution at Stanford, he is 2001 Nobel laureate in economics, and Professor Spence is one of the most highly regarded scholars among his peers since his very early academic career. He was Rhodes Scholar. By the way, Richard Haas was also one of the Rhodes Scholars. And Spence received very prestigious John Bates Clark Medal from the American Economic Association in 1981. So this award is given to the most promising young economists. So you can see his quality from then on. He eventually got the Nobel Award. Most importantly, he is currently the IGE's honorary chairman, succeeding the late chairman Paul Volcker. Well, please turn on this conversation. Okay, hello, Mike. So nice to see you.
Good to see you, Al. I'm pleased to be with you.
Well, since our time is limited, why don't we immediately begin our conversation regarding the current state and the prospect of the world economy and major risk factors and the policy challenges. Sure. Before the recent rapid spread of Delta variant of the coronavirus, the world economy seems to have gotten back on a robust growth track, although uneven across countries. But now the situation doesn't seem to be that optimistic. What is your general assessment in this regard?
Well, I think you're right. I mean, as you know, I just wrote something that said things look very different now than they did 3 months ago in May. And in May, we thought we had a reasonably robust, but somewhat uneven recovery. We had a challenge with the vaccine rollout globally, but sectors that had shut down were starting to open up. I think Asia was probably, in general, ahead of the rest of the world, but the developed countries were catching up. Now, I think we have, headwinds that we did not anticipate, or at least not properly facing us. So, in no particular order, the supply chains are clogged up in a way that I think really nobody anticipated. So we knew there were sort of little blockages. We thought they were transitory. They look like they're of unknown duration, but a lot longer lasting than we thought. And that is causing prices to rise in a lot of places, and that is correlated with something I imagine we'll talk about, which is the risk of new inflationary pressures globally. In addition, we didn't see the Delta variant in its full-blown form coming in, so we're seeing partial shutdowns and countermeasures being taken everywhere that won't help with the speed of the recovery, for sure. And so, you have those two factors. And then the other thing that I think, was sort of shocking was the scope and frequency and magnitude of the extreme climate events globally. So in the past, we've had extreme climate events that scientists have told us that, they are becoming more extreme and frequent. But really, this is, I think, the first time that we face a situation in which the climate events are so broad in scope and coverage that they may actually produce significant headwinds to growth. And then you have the recent UN report that essentially declared code red on the climate change front. Basically, my interpretation of what they said, Il, is that what we experienced this summer is the new climate normal for the next at least 20 years. We can expect at least this kind of activity, and the window for preventing that is essentially shut. The remaining task is pretty important, but it is to prevent even more serious second half of century problems associated with temperature increases in excess of 1.5 degrees Celsius. So when you add it all up, it looks like a much tougher sort of economic environment than we thought we had in even 3 or 4 months ago.
Yeah, great. You had a very good overview of the current situation. Let's get into some more detail on the issues you mentioned. In fact, the U.S. Fed now seems to be ready to start tapering or reversing the expansionary policies pretty soon. In this regard, I'm very sure our audience would very much like to share your views first on more specifically on the inflation risk, and second, the potential impacts of the faster tapering on the global financial and asset markets, and emerging economies in particular. Could you make some comments and observations in this regard?
So I think that a growing set of highly credible economists and other commentators and people with experience in policy are warning of a risk of inflation. I think this has to be taken seriously. Initially, they were warning that we had reasonably rapid recoveries underway. We have, unlike the great financial crisis, where we had mostly central bank, quantitative easing and other forms of hope for stimulus. Now we have massive fiscal programs going along with highly accommodative monetary policies. And so the worry was that, if you thought that, maybe after the great financial crisis, we needed a different balance between fiscal and monetary, that different balance didn't mean huge fiscal and monetary policy all in, right? Now, if you add to that what appears to be pretty stubborn supply problems, let me be quite specific. We have shortages of semiconductors, we have shortages of containers, we have shortages of cargo shipping, we have huge increases in construction materials costs, we have reported labor shortages all over the place, in multiple industries. Driving up prices. So when you add a big demand stimulus to accommodative monetary policy and unanticipated sort of clogging up on the supply side globally, and I think you do have a situation in which you could start to see, a change in the inflationary anchors that we've lived with for so long. Now, maybe a little bit more inflation is good because we were below targets for so long. But I think the concern is that, we might get a regime shift. The other thing is more sort of technical that you hear people talk about is that the Federal Reserve at some point in the past 6 months announced that they were going to, err in the direction of accommodation so as not to risk truncating, a really robust recovery in the job markets and in the economy as a whole. But in the course of saying that, they said, we're going to base our policies on outcomes, not forecasts, which is different. And the reason it's different is that in the past, most monetary policy people felt that monetary policy operated with sort of fairly long and variable lags. And so if you operated on outcomes as opposed to forecasts, even though the forecasts are, risk error, then you have a situation where you can fall behind the curve. And so a combination of those things, I think, means that the mood is shifting in the direction of taking inflation seriously, and the tapering that you referred to that's now being discussed. I mean, there's a massive amount of liquidity in the global economy right now. And so the people that I know and trust who think about these things think that it's unlikely we'll have another taper tantrum of the type that we had back in 2013, where liquidity was, much, much more constrained. That said, we could have significant volatility. We could have sort of pockets of distress in countries with, stretched fiscal resources and, sovereign debt issues that have gotten worse in the course of the pandemic. And you could have, in combination with the things we discussed before, headwinds to growth, you could have a fairly significant shift in asset prices. I mean, they up until relatively recently, asset prices have been driven by this massive amount of liquidity in the market, and it it may be that they're going to sort of, you'll have a regime shift there, and you'll see a downward reset in asset prices, in part because expectations of interest rate shifting. That will change the kind of portfolio allocation away from the extreme dependence on risk assets to generate any kind of return. So basically, you've got a situation in which you could get what looks like pretty big changes. I don't think they're, how do I say it? in America, we would say, I don't think they'll upset the apple cart. They're not big enough, to disrupt, most economies. Certainly the major emerging economies and the developed economies, I think, will have to struggle with it, but they're not going to be knocked off the rails, so to speak.
In that regard, I think, that the global community as a whole could deal with the problem in terms of the risk magnitude, but still we need some economic policy coordination and the policy cooperation in that regard. Now, okay, with regard to climate change, it is very appropriate for you to point this out. In fact, this conference itself deals with ESG, environmental issues, and this climate change, as you in your writing, I referred to the Fed's report that says climate change is becoming a factor affecting macroeconomic performance. And everybody thought the climate change is a long-term thing, and it will affect our lives in more in slower manner, but now it is with us. It is becoming a serious matter. If it is becoming more normal rather than aberration or outlier, what can we do about it? And of course, we are expecting to have COP21 Glasgow meeting in November. I hope the leaders do something about it in a serious way. But the important thing is closer international cooperation and participation. And that's the only thing we can do, right?
Yeah, and yes, absolutely. So COP26 in Glasgow in November is really important. The challenge for everybody, all the participants, is to increase their commitments in such a way that it's consistent with a carbon budget that keeps global warming to something like 1.5 degrees Celsius. COP21 was a start, and everybody was optimistic about it, but the declared plans were not consistent with a carbon budget that gets the job done. So you're absolutely right. We need commitments at COP26 that are much more ambitious and much closer in time. The next 10 years matters a lot than the ones we got 5 years ago. So it's a big challenge, but I think the important thing for people to understand is that the point of stressing the urgency of that is to avoid really unpredictable but potentially catastrophic outcomes in the second half of the century. What the UN panel basically said was that the climate events that we've sort of lived with, floods pretty much everywhere, droughts, forest fires of enormous magnitude in places that hadn't seen them in a long time. This is the new climate normal. There's not a whole lot we can do about that in terms of changing the trajectory. So we have to live with it, react to it, and at the same time deal with these longer term investments and issues. Now, I might say a word. I mean, the investments that are required are absolutely enormous. I mean, nobody knows for sure, but you could be talking $2 to $3 trillion a year with a mix of, say, a 50-50 mix of private and public investment. So your conference, which is focusing on ESG, is really, right at the center of the target. I mean, the private sector is going to play a crucial role in all of this, and commitments across the board from the business and financial sector will be critical elements in success.
By the way, you very rightly pointed out the necessity of the reforming IFI, international financial institutions, in this regard. Actually, that makes sense because climate change is and becoming more serious way macroeconomic factor. So IFIs must commit more seriously about dealing with this climate change. In fact, in Seoul conference, heads of G20 nations agreed to change quota distribution of this institution, to make this institution more legitimate, and also increase the resources. So this climate change, again, I support it.
Absolutely. I mean, the IFIs have critical roles to play. Finance has a critical role to play. Mm-hmm. Getting the financing available on a kind of global basis is important, and I suspect you're right that that part of a cooperative international effort would be to significantly increase the capitalization of the IFIs and other institutions that can play a kind of quasi-public role in this. And finally, we're dealing with uncertainty here. We're dealing essentially with insurance. What we should be starting to think about is a sort of a robust global insurance system. This is in reacting to what we're already going to live with, a global, robust insurance system that's a combination of social, publicly funded insurance and private sector insurance. I mean, there's already evidence that in the face of climate change, a whole lot of things that you normally insure are going to be uninsurable if we leave it to the private sector. And that's not a criticism of the private sector. It's just they can't distribute that much risk without some kind of complementary institution. So I've speculated we may need another IFI. That deals with essentially with this kind of problem.
Okay, now time is running out. The last quick observation, if you have any. Currently we see geopolitically motivated protectionism and picking the winners type of industrial policies, giving subsidies and so forth, would go against the principle of the WTO and multilateralism. But this protectionism and nationalism motivated these policies have a lot to do with this intensifying U.S.-China hegemonic competition. I think the trend will continue. How you see this?
I think I see it much the same way you do, which is, I think part of the experience of the last few years with rising tensions, the so-called trade war, and so on, is that, and now the pandemic, is that countries that can afford to do this, mainly big ones and relatively high-income ones, are going to start focusing on a little bit, maybe not more than a little bit, on self-sufficiency, which means, can we produce and supply crucial things to our population if things get worse, on a global basis, or if there's a big shortage of supply, will we be at the end of the queue? So I think you'll see this in, a variety of sectors. Pharmaceuticals, I think you're going to see it because, because we had vaccine nationalism, and it was understandable. Elected officials tend to focus on their own populations first, but it's a kind of Nash equilibrium you don't want to see in a global situation where there are clear benefits to having a cooperative non-equilibrium outcome. You still have a big challenge with the vaccine rollout. There's lots of low-income countries that are barely starting to get vaccines. COVAX is struggling to buy vaccines. The developed countries have optioned more vaccine purchasers than they probably conceivably could need. And so lots of people are sort of trying to help with this, but the bottom line is you're going to see some pulling in, I think, that's inevitable, and it runs in the direction of risk mitigation via self-sufficiency. So I think the challenge, if you look at it, if you sort of accept that framing, is not to go overboard on this and start losing all the benefits of international specialization and development, that we keep open, a relatively open global economy and just accept that there'll be more, imposed constraints on it. So then, because of digital technology and its strategic applications, national security, military, et cetera, we're going to see more of that, but we don't have to go overboard and start letting it dominate the kind of global picture.
Yeah, the general bottom line here is, again, closer international cooperation and collaboration, even for vaccines. As you pointed out in your paper, the total cost involved are not that high. Well, Mike, thank you very much for sharing your very enlightening views with us. I'm very sure our audience will be so glad to see you again.
Well, thank you for having me, and I hope you have a wonderful conference. I'm sure it'll be important and stimulating.
Okay. Well, with this, why don't I invite Professor Park to share his illuminating views. By the way, he is currently teaching at the Graduate School of International Studies at the Seoul National University. He is the leading expert and scholar in the field of Japanese politics, Japan's international relations, and Japan-Korea relations, and Japan-US relations, everything Japan-related. So I'm sure he will enlighten us, particularly paying more attention to Japan in the context of current very volatile geopolitical situation. Dr. Park.
Thank you, Minister Sagon. I'm extremely honored to be invited to this very important and timely conference. And I'm very happy to see all these globally eminent scholars and practitioners, even though it's virtual. But I enjoyed that talk. So as we have a limited time available, I just confine my comments on Richard Haas, the speech, and I add up a few points. I basically agree with most of the points raised by Dr. Haas, but I just want to remind his comments that especially from the Korean perspective, it's very important to remember that there is almost a bipartisan consensus about the nature of the relationship between the United States and China. And then competition is a kind of basic trend of the times. And then, as he said, we are living in a very different century that is very different from the past. And so if we misinterpret this trend, many think that this is a kind of just a partisan trend, and then we can find a different way. But actually, it's not. When I was in Washington 3 years ago, I happened to attend the kind of very interesting ceremony, retiring ceremony of James Jones, who was the first national security advisor under the Obama administration. It was still the Trump presidency. The moderator asked him, you worked for the President Obama. We are living under Trump. But you are not a commander of the U.S. Marine anymore. You are not the national security advisor anymore. You are not the chairman of the think tank anymore. So you can sleep in peace from tonight. But if there is any one issue that may wake you up in the middle of the night, what is it? Without any blink, he said China. Why China? China is militarily strong, economically vibrant, politically stable, and has a strong will to catch up. So I cannot sleep comfortably when you think of China. So that's a democracy. But so the point here is that we should not forget that there is a kind of strong strongly emerging bipartisan consensus in the United States about the nature of the relationship. But the second point I wanted to say is that from our perspective, I think we have to find a very sophisticated strategy to navigate through this competition, considering that competition is not the only feature of the U.S.-China relations, as Dr. Haas raised. I remember the Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, said, U.S. would remain competitive when it should be, collaborative when it can be, and adversarial when it must be. That means there is a kind of a different baskets of issues that they are focusing on. So if you just kind of think that the competition is the only trend of the times, that we may feel pressured that we make a choice between the United States and China. Mm-hmm. But actually, there's some realms that we can we can be a little bit more comfortably dealing with. So I think there will be a kind of strong competition in terms of strategic trade and economy in general and technology, and confrontation in the military security issues, but remain very cooperative in transnational agendas and non-strategic trade area. So I think when we navigate through all this turbulent sea of competition, I think some channels are very turbulent and fast, but some channels still remain relatively comfortable and silent. So I think we have to be very careful when we pass through these channels of competition between the United States and China. But I think one of the great points raised by Dr. Haas was that Korea doesn't have to choose between the United States and China. But I think we have to be clear that South Korea is a close ally to the United States, and China is a strategic partner to work with. So, but I always think that China cannot be a substitute to the United States. So what we have to be very careful is that we have to stand with the United States when it comes to security alliance, in defending South Korea from external attack, and then especially in the kind of high-tech area and the strategic trade. As Dr. Haas mentioned, we should be very mindful not to go against the interest of the United States and other global community. If I add up a few points, that he mentioned Taiwan issue. I think this is a very delicate issue, very sophisticated. Many Koreans do not want to involve in any contingencies and emergencies in the Taiwan Strait. So I think we have a limited leverages available in our hands. But we have to strongly advocate the principle of free navigation. And then we should stand against the kind of any attempt to change the status quo by force or the preemptive strike by any party. But at the same time, we have to be prepared for any kind of chances that the United States introduce the conception of so-called strategic flexibility. Even though U.S. forces in Korea are basically postured against any kind of threat from North Korea, but there is a kind of slight possibility that if any contingencies take place in Taiwan area, the strategic flexibility conception can be applied. I think we have to be prepared, and then should consult with the United States much more carefully about that issue. I'm very happy to hear from Dr. Haas that Korea-Japan relations is so important for all of us, to the United States, to South Korea, to Japan. I think I completely agree with him that it is a self-defeating and strategically disadvantageous if South Korea and Japan continue to struggle and then maintain the conflicts between the two countries. Yeah, I don't think it gives any benefits to South Korea, to Japan, or to the United States. I think even though we have to carefully manage the historical controversies and some pending issues between the two countries, we will take a kind of a firm stance that we can cooperate with Japan on many other issues, social, economic, cultural issues, and including strategic possibilities to, in a wider spectrums and the wider regions, including the Indo-Pacific area. So the Indo-Pacific area, our government is very cautious in joining it and jumping into adventure very actively. But I think we can do it through indirect participation and consultation with the United States. As we had a summit meeting in May, we can cooperate with the United States and other countries in the areas of semiconductor and battery, biotechnology, and rare earths and other things. So I think Japan is a kind of relatively comfortable partner to work with if we can manage very thorny, controversial issues related to the past history. I'll stop there.
Well, thank you very much. Very, very succinct and clear exposition of the current geopolitical situation and very clear points, very, very useful for our policymakers and leaders of particularly at this time the government. Well, I think we have to end this session, and before we end this session, I would like to make just two observations based on all these points made by speakers. The number one is that the U.S.-China hegemonic competition is not a short-term phenomenon. It will be continued far into the future, and therefore, Korea in particular need a longer-term vision for national security and economic prosperity and stability within this context. In that context, I'm sure this alliance issue is Korea-Japan relations and our alliance with United States, and how to deal with China. I think this, if we had more time, Professor Park will share very, very clear his ideas about this. But in any case, this is our really important critical task for all Koreans, and particular leaders and political leaders in particular, and government policymakers. Second is the climate change, the E part of ESG. As Mike Spence pointed out, very recently, US Fed and the IMF had a report saying that, specifically saying that the climate change is becoming a critical factor affecting macroeconomic performances. So far, climate change was more, it affects way of living and well-being, human well-being in a slower, longer term, the period. But it is with us, and it is a serious short-term issue as well. So in this regard, I'm sure there are a lot to be done, but international cooperation and participation is very, very important. And in this regard in particular, I would say that Korea can play a role, as we did in doing something about the global financial system and at the G20 Seoul Summit. I think Korea can be a factor, can be a player. And so I hope we do more on this and contribute towards solving some of the difficult problems. Well, with this, I think we have to the end, and please join me thanking Professor Falk and the other participants for this session. Thank you.